So good morning and welcome to today's event, which is the COVID-19 vaccine and your employer obligations, a really important topic right now. My name is Paul Holden, President and CEO of the Burnaby Board of Trade, for those that don't know me. And I'd like to start off by acknowledging that the event is being held, or at least where I am, on the traditional territory of the Coast Salish peoples, including the Tsleil-Waututh, Musqueam and Squamish nations. I'd like to start off as well by acknowledging the Burnaby Board of Trade's annual partners. We have, as many of you know, a great roster of organisations that are supporting us throughout the year in the work that we do, the initiatives that we undertake on behalf of the business community. So you can see there that at the platinum level, we have the Burnaby Now and the BCIT School of Business. At the gold level, we have SFU, Pacific Blue Cross, Douglas College, Fortis BC, Electronic Arts and ABC Recycling. And the silver level, we have Scotiabank, Trans Mountain, Appia Development, Alexander College, Port of Vancouver, and TD Bank Group. And normally at this point, if we were live in person, everybody would be applauding right now, and we'd have a resounding round of applause. So I'll just imagine that you're all doing that virtually, and that we're all thanking our sponsors and partners for their continued support. This event is made possible by our Centre for Burnaby Business Recovery and Resilience. The centre is sponsored by a number of organisations, and we're really grateful to have their support. I think you can see the centre sponsors on the screen right now. The centre is a top priority for the Board of Trade. It's the home of programming and initiatives focused on supporting the local business community and rebuilding from the COVID-19 pandemic. It was created by our Burnaby Business Recovery Task Force, and the centre is a hub for our ongoing resources and supports for business. And it's truly a unique initiative in the business community. And we're very proud of what we're setting up and the work we're able to do on behalf of the business community. So jumping in, I'd like to introduce our guest speakers today, Jim Wu and Jessica Foreman from Forte Law. Jim is an employment lawyer with Forte Law, and before joining them in 2019, he ran his own solo employment law practice where he drafted and reviewed job offers and severance packages and fought for and defended against wrongful dismissal claims. As a former EI adjudicator, he also advised on the ins and outs of employment insurance and represented both employees and employers at the Social Security Tribunal. We're also joined by Jessica Foreman from Forte Law. Jessica is an employment lawyer and litigator and practices exclusively in the areas of employment law and workplace and human rights. She focuses on assisting employers and employees to solve their workplace problems. Jessica's originally from Southern California, so very similar weather to where we are here today, where she attended law school and practiced as a commercial litigator in a large US firm for several years before moving to the Lower Mainland to work for a large regional firm in Vancouver and then focusing her practice on employment law. So thank you to Jim and Jessica. Thank you very much for joining us today. I would like to remind everybody that today's session is being recorded. We encourage you to add your questions to the chat box, and Jessica and Jim will get to as many as we can at the end of the presentation. As with all of our presentations, the information shared today is general and based on best practices, so please consult your lawyer for formal advice should you need that as you move forward. We encourage you to share, obviously, it's sort of general information, but obviously please be aware that this is being recorded as you frame your questions. So I'm going to kick off, and the way we're doing this is there's not a presentation up front. We're keeping it sort of flowing in the Q&A format right from the beginning. So I'm going to kick off by asking Jim to perhaps give us a refresher on what our employers' health and safety obligations with respect to their employees right now.
Happy to do that, Paul. I'm just going to share, I've got a presentation prepared and I'm just going to share it with everyone. So as a business owner, you have to make sure that whoever shows up at your business establishment comes and leaves safely. This is not a new rule, and what COVID-19 has done is added another layer of responsibility for all businesses to take measures to reduce the likelihood of transmission of COVID-19. Now, since I believe it was May of 2020, the WorkSafe BC, the tribunal and the body that's responsible for all of our provinces' health and safety measures and laws, they've implemented a requirement that every business must now have a COVID-19 safety plan. Now, the plan consists of 6 steps, and to help everyone memorize these 6 steps, I've created an acronym. It's called WINDOW. And what WINDOW consists of is the first requirement possible transmission. And again, this is just general rules. Everyone is different. It's different for every business. Every business has their own needs, but you are required to first conduct a workplace risk assessment to see what are some possible areas which COVID-19 has the likelihood for increased transmission. And then the next step for the WINDOW is that you must implement measures to reduce that risk. So again, every business is different. For example, some businesses, if you can, you might want to implement measures to allow your employees to work at home. That way, it reduces the risk of possible transmission. For businesses where that's not possible, perhaps what you have to do is implement measures that will create barriers, install plexiglass, physical barriers in order to reduce the likelihood of transmission. And that can also consist of the third step, which is nailing down your policies, because the policies are the rules, they are the fine print of how you implement these measures. And all these, of course, are subject to change, but you got to first nail down what your policies are. After you've nailed down your policies, the next step is you have to develop communication plans and training. So that communication means communicating to both your employees and also your customers and clients as well. They need to know what measures you're implementing to increase their safety and their health. You need to be open to suggestion and changes. And this is why I talked about earlier when this whole WINDOW plan, it's an ongoing, consistently changing. It's consistently changing with what's happening with our health and safety measures implemented by Bonnie Henry and the provincial government, but also be open to suggestions and changes from your employees and your customers, because they will give you feedback on how you can go about changing, making it effective. And the last part is make sure you walk it through with your staff. Your staff are critical. They are the people who make this work. And again, this is not just an individual responsibility, it's a collective responsibility where everyone has to do their part to ensure the health and safety of everyone. So this is what WINDOW is, again, summarized, and I'm sure every business or at least all of our members with the Burnaby Board of Trade now has a very comprehensive WINDOW plan. If you don't, get one started right away, because every business is subject to a possible inspection. And if there's any complaint or any suspicion raised by WCB as to what measures you've implemented for your safety measures, guess what the first question they're going to ask you is, where is your COVID-19 safety plan? And you better have that prepared when that question comes.
Thank you, Jim. Is that the end of your part of the presentation?
That is, in terms of just a rough summary of what our obligations are.
Thank you for that, and some excellent points raised there that we all need to make sure that we have that plan in place. We need to have it for compliance, but we need to have it for the general health and safety of our staff and our customers as well. So thank you for sharing that with us. And if anybody has any questions, I'm sure they can reach out through us to your organization. Jessica, I've got a few questions for you that we already had kind of prepared, and as I say to all attendees, please feel free to be posting your own questions. But question number one, I guess, which is one that we hear a lot, is can you force your employees to get vaccinated?
Yeah, thanks, Paul. And so it's important that all of the questions that I'm going to touch on now about vaccines are considered in the context of what Jim just talked about with respect to an employer's obligation to keep the workplace safety. So Jim, if you don't mind moving forward to the next slide when you have a chance. And so just it's a good overarching thing to keep in mind, the workplace safety. That needs to be considered by employers along with human rights considerations. And as you see on the screen here, there are 13 prohibited grounds under the Human Rights Code that I'm sure all of our attendees know that employers cannot discriminate against an employee on any of these bases. And so when we're looking at an employer's obligations with respect to vaccines, we know that they have an obligation to have the workplace safe, which would require or hopefully encourage everyone to be vaccinated. But at the same time, it has to be balanced against these prohibited grounds. And they may have employees, because of possible religious observances or other disabilities, that they may be unable or unwilling or are not going to get vaccinated. So these are the kind of competing interests that are going to really sort of set the stage as we talk about what an employer's obligations are. So, and the other thing, obviously, is to keep into consideration our privacy considerations, right? Employees have a right to privacy. Employers have to be careful about what they ask and what they demand with respect to their employees and their health considerations. So those are sort of the overarching themes as we talk about vaccines. As we look at whether or not an employer can actually force employees to be vaccinated, we have to start with the provincial health measures. And right now, there is no mandatory requirement from Dr. Henry or the province for vaccines. They are highly recommended, and the province is doing everything it can to encourage employees, but it is not mandatory. So until and if that changes, employers need to take their guidance from the province. And I say this and will say it repeatedly, that the landscape is constantly changing, and so employers should pay attention as those provincial requirements do change. So given the fact that the guidelines are not mandatory right now, it's our view that in a general sense, employers cannot make it mandatory that their employees are vaccinated. Now, of course, with everything in the law, there are a number of exceptions that I'm going to go into where it might be, an employer may be able to, but from a general perspective, until the province makes it mandatory, an employer cannot simply just turn to its workforce and say everybody must get vaccinated now. It's also very early in the vaccination rollout, so there's not very much judicial guideline or case law on the issue. It's going to be constantly evolving, and I expect in a few months from now, we may be having a very different conversation. But in terms of the state of the law right now, that's where we're at. So there may be some exceptions, and certain industries, like, for example, in the healthcare industry or nursing homes or long-term care homes, those may be the kinds of situations where an employer can mandate that their employees become vaccinated. And the question that employers will need to ask is whether or not the requirement of a vaccine is reasonable given the expectations of what that employee has to do. So for an employee who's constantly in contact with the public or with the public who may be really sensitive or have a higher risk, that may be a situation where an employer, under certain circumstances, can require that those employees get vaccinated. They're going to always have to keep in mind these prohibited grounds and the human rights considerations. And I would encourage any employer who wants to develop a policy or take steps to mandate vaccines that you get some legal advice, that you talk it through with a lawyer so that we can really focus on the specific needs of your industry. Jim and I both advise employers and employees, and one thing we know for certain is that every single situation is different. Every employer has different requirements for its workplace, has a different makeup of employees, has different business considerations, and all of those will go into this consideration of, is it reasonable to require your employees to be vaccinated? So my general answer is, at the moment, no, you can't have a blanket requirement that your employees be vaccinated. There may be some certain circumstances where certain employers in certain sectors are able to do so.
Thanks, Jessica. And I suppose a question that you mentioned about privacy. So I suppose a question that might also spring to mind is, as an employer, can you even ask an employee if they've been vaccinated?
And again, that's a great question. I think you can certainly ask the question, but that same issue of is it reasonably related to the workplace will come into play. So if you've got employees working from home and they're not ever interacting with the public or each other, then that's going to be a situation where it's a lot more tenuous to show a relationship between the question and is that information necessary, as opposed to workers who are constantly interacting with the public or constantly interacting with each other and unable to socially distance. That may be a situation where it is reasonable, because remember, Paul, the employers still have an obligation to keep the workplace safe. So you've got to ask a question to ensure safety, but you have to balance it with the privacy. It's similar to, if you've got an employer and there's a warehouse and there's an employee who's responsible for lifting things and is now unable to, and by not being able to lift it properly is putting a customer at risk or another employee at risk. The employer is allowed to ask about an employee's health condition in order for them to reasonably continue to perform their job. So it's just got to be that connection.
Okay, thank you. So we've asked about, can you tell your existing employees that they must be vaccinated? And I think we've had your answer from that, Jessica. But what about making it a condition of employment if you're going to be bringing somebody on board? Can you make that a condition?
Right. And my answer is going to be similar, which is it depends. And again, I think it's going to be really industry specific. I was recently reading, for example, the cruise industry, which, I'm not sure why anyone's rushing to go on a cruise ship now, but they are requiring their employees to all be vaccinated before re-entering the ship. And one can understand that's a clear situation where those employees are working in close quarters, they're not able to socially distance. There's a connection there between the request and the workplace. So because vaccines are not mandatory, employers should be careful in making it a condition of employment. However, there may be situations where they are able to, when it's reasonably necessary for that employee to perform their job. So I think that is, go ahead, Jim, thank you. It is going to be industry specific. I think we're going to see this, for example, in the healthcare industry, certainly, and maybe some other industries, whether it's essential to performing the job, and are there less intrusive alternatives? These are questions that we often see asked when we're talking generally about, imposing certain requirements in the workplace. So employers, again, should just be mindful of these questions. But they may very well be able to make it a condition of employment.
Right. Okay. Moving on to another one, and please keep bringing questions in. We've got a couple of questions in, and I'll weave those into one or two of the others that I've got coming up. So we'll make sure we cover the points that are being asked. And thank you to everybody. Keep those questions coming. Can employees or an employee refuse to come to work until everyone is vaccinated? I suppose as we look to, there are some organizations where they already have their teams in the office or the workplace, but for many, many organizations, they're looking at the process of bringing people back into the workplace. And I suppose a question that they may have already had, or they may be anticipating having, is, I don't want to come to work until everyone's been vaccinated.
Right. Yeah, no, this is a question we've seen in a different iteration so far. I've had a number of employer clients raise this with respect to masks, or employees saying, I don't want to come to work if I don't have plexiglass around my desk, or certain things like that. So this is, again, an it depends answer, unfortunately. But here there's an initial threshold that the employer has to look at, which is, going back to Jim's opening comments, is if the employer has done everything it's required to do to keep the workplace safe, then they can require their employees to be at work. So if they have their COVID protocol and they're cleaning and masking and keeping space and doing everything they're supposed to do, then they're able to say to their employees, the workplace is safe, you need to return. Now, if you have an employee who has particular needs, like is extra sensitive or has an immunity, a lower immunity or other health considerations, then we move into the human rights area and the employer's requirements to accommodate that employee. So if an employee does say, I can't come back to work until everyone's vaccinated because I'm at high risk, the employer has an obligation to accommodate them. And that includes a number of steps. First and foremost, the employer is entitled to ask the employee for medical information. They don't have to just take their word for it. And once they get adequate medical information, then they have an obligation to try to find an accommodation. Can the employee work from home? Can the employee work in a different space? Are there steps we can take adjusting hours where that employee can still do their work? The employer's duty to accommodate is not endless. They only have to do it up to the point of what's called undue hardship. And again, that's one of these very nebulous concepts where you look at each employer and say, what is an undue hardship? So for example, an employer doesn't have to build a separate office, an enclosed office for an employee who's got a health situation. But if they can adjust hours or allow the person to work from home, then they should do that, and they are legally required to do that. The other important thing to remember about the duty to accommodate is it's a two-way street, that while the employer should be reasonable and try to come up with solutions, the employee also has to be reasonable and try them. They simply can't reject every proposal presented by an employer without, good reason. So, overall, an employee can't simply return to work until everybody's vaccinated if the employer is making the environment safe, if the employer is following everything WorkSafe has said, and if they have tried to accommodate them. Obviously, I always advise my employer clients and employees, it's the best practice to try to work together with your employees, come up with an accommodation so that all of your employees do feel safe and can continue to be productive.
Thanks, Jessica. And I suppose weaving a couple of questions that we've already covered together with a couple of the comments that are being posted here is, it's an interesting conundrum, really, isn't it? That if it's challenging for an employer to ask employees, have you been vaccinated, and expect to get a response, as part of that planning process of bringing people back, there's a bit of an information or data gap there that you might find yourself having if you're not getting the responses back. And I suppose the other question is, if somebody says, well, I'm not going to come back to work until everybody's vaccinated, I don't suppose you'll necessarily definitively know if everyone's been vaccinated because of the information you can ask.
And that's an excellent point. And that's why, the other big thing that I encourage all the employers is to do their best to provide employees with information, right? We can't mandate that they're going to vaccine, but we can do everything we can to encourage it. Things like, number one, setting a good example and you yourself getting vaccinated, talking about it openly amongst your workforce, providing access to accurate scientific information from the province about the availability of them, the safety of them, the importance of them, and having it be part of the conversation. Because the more people are talking about it, the easier it is to sort of, I would say, get a sense of what if people are uncomfortable or don't want to get one. And you as an employer can really do a lot, I think, to try to direct people to the resources and invite those conversations and encourage employees to come to you if they're worried about it, either that others aren't getting it or they don't want to. Talk about it, give them the information, and set that good example. But I agree, Paul, it's not going to be an easy path forward. And, you can't force an employee to tell you whether or not you have been vaccinated or not, unless it's one of those industries where it's required. All you can do is your best to try to encourage everybody to get the information, to share the information, and to be open about it, as it is a collective need that we all need to take these steps forward.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sure we'll be weaving backwards and forwards a few times on this, because a lot of these things overlap, don't they, in terms of the conversation?
Absolutely.
That we have. Perhaps you can touch on some rules employers need to follow with respect to allowing their employees to be vaccinated. There's obviously the government announced last week about mandating that employees are given
3
hours, I think it is, to to be able to get their vaccination. What other rules do employers need to follow?
So yeah, that it's very timely that the government came up with this, I think it was April 1. So there is a job protected leave right now, a COVID related job protective leave that I'm sure all of you employers are already very familiar with. That covers off things like if an employee's sick or if they need to care for someone, if schools are closed, those kinds of things. So what the government did is it added 2 more categories to that job protected leave. It's an unpaid leave, but if an employee needs to get the vaccine or needs to accompany assist a dependent in being vaccinated, they are allowed a job protected leave in order to take the time to go get those vaccines. The other interesting thing that I was reading when the government made this announcement, and I think will hopefully be particularly important to all of your members, is that the government has said it's going to explore options to provide workers with paid leave to get vaccines, and it's going to do this in consultation with the business community. So I haven't seen any more information yet about how they're going to do that consultation, but I of course would invite all of you who have any views on that as employers of whether or not the government should be providing paid leave or helping employers with that, to keep an eye out for that consultation, provide it, because that will obviously provide some assistance going forward to employers who need to allow their employees time off. And of course, the other thing is, if the vaccination appointments are only available during working hours, you are required to allow your employee time off and a job protected leave to go get that vaccine. That being said, you're well within your rights to ask for confirmation, for them to let you know, to give you advance notice if they can and should. As of now, you usually get the vaccine appointments well in advance. So hopefully we won't have too many situations where somebody just doesn't show up at work and says, I'm getting vaccinated. But I think employers can, as we start to see how the appointments are going to be set, you can certainly set out your own standards of, let us know, try and stagger it, or work with us to set these appointments and go get the vaccinations. And I think everybody should keep an eye out as the government provides some more insight and information onto whether or not they are going to be providing paid leave as opposed to just right now the unpaid job protection.
Thanks for raising that, Jessica. And in fact, I'm one of only, I think it's 3 Chamber of Commerce, actually 3 or 4 Chamber of Commerce folks on Minister Ravi Kalan's Business Recovery Task Force panel. And that was a point that was discussed at the last meeting we had. So it's something that we're providing some feedback on.
Oh, great.
And something that we're looking for some comments from our members as well, because I think it's important that we do reflect the views of the business community as the government looks to make that decision.
Great.
I think I probably know the answer to this one, but I'll ask it anyway. Can an employer fire an employee if they refuse to vaccinate?
Well, I'm going to pass it back over to Jim, who's going to talk generally about this question and about firing employees in general. But yeah, I'll let him answer that one.
Thanks, Jessica.
Well, you just asked one of my favorite questions to advise, which is like, what is the law surrounding firing employees? So I'll start with a very general picture. So employers, they have the right to fire employees. And the general law is that you can fire an employee without giving them any reason, and you can do so whenever you want. That's the general rule out there. However, because of COVID-19, there's a lot of new things that you need to be aware of before you embark on firing an employee. The first thing among those is the timing, because let's say, because this is where it gets complicated. And I'll give you a few examples to illustrate that. Let's say an employee brings about a workplace issue. She feels that not everyone's getting vaccinated. She feels that not everyone's wearing masks, and it's creating a lot of disharmony among your other employees. And the employer decides at that very moment, for the sake of the organization, it's probably better to let that employee go. Or you terminated the employee, now you have what's called a prohibited action complaint from WorkSafe BC. And what that is when an employer cannot fire an employee as a reaction to that employee raising a health and safety concern. You're not allowed to do that. The other thing that employers are not allowed to do to fire employees is if it's based on a protected ground. So this is what Jessica mentioned earlier about human rights. So let's say let's use the example of vaccination. So employers cannot, of course, force employees to vaccinate. And let's say one of these employees, she has a situation where if she takes the vaccine, her health can be severely jeopardized. And she made the employer aware of this, and she told the employer, look, it's not that I don't want to take the vaccines, because if I do take the vaccine, I can be severely compromised health-wise. And the employer, again, for the sake of instilling harmony, encouraging cohesion within the workplace, decides to let that employee go. Well, now you have what's called a discrimination complaint from the Human Rights Tribunal. And on top of all of those, you also, every time you fire an employee, you always have the risk of being sued for wrongful dismissal. A lot of employers, when they ask how much, and we have a question about this, which is how much severance, what are my obligations, how much severance do I need to pay an employee? Most of the time, this is the general picture, but I paid the employee employment standards. I paid them, my employees worked more than 3 years, but less than 4 years. I already paid that employee 3 weeks. Why is this employee raising a fuss? Well, the employment standards, these weeks of entitlements, those are just the minimum severance that your employee is entitled to. If you don't have a contract that restricts these entitlements, you can be looking at paying that employee more severance. And this is what we call common law severance. And this is the basis of every single wrongful dismissal lawsuit and they look at something more complex than that. They look at the employee's age, they look at the employee's position, their length of service, and the availability of similar jobs. And this is all premised on the fact that an employee's job, it's a very special type of contract because it affects that employee's well-being, their identity, and their sense of self-worth. So the courts do recognize that under these circumstances, employers have to provide employees what's called reasonable notice. And reasonable notice are, of course, all premised on these factors, these 4 factors. So this is what employers are looking at when they go about terminating an employee. What I recommend employers to do, and this I call the A, B, C, D, and E's of resolving workplace conflict. Every time you're thinking of firing an employee or instilling some sort of a disciplinary measure, the first thing you do is you assess the situation. So that's the A part, assess the situation. How much time is this going to cost the workplace? What are the pros and cons? That's the first part. The second part is be proactive. If you've identified the problem, take action. And that's where the C comes into place. Make sure you communicate with the employee. Don't leave everything. Take action, but make sure you communicate. And when you communicate to the employee, make sure you document this. Document your communications because that's crucial. And when you're done all of that, that's when you conduct what's called an evaluation. So that's the last component. Evaluate the situation, see what's going on, whether that's changed your assessment of the whole situation. And if not, under these circumstances, you still want to pursue it, then it's probably recommended you get some advice so that you know what the risks are when going about doing that. So that's the general essence of my kind of spiel about handling terminations. Now, to answer your question, can an employer terminate an employee just because they refuse to vaccinate? it all depends on the context. The context matters. Jessica just said earlier that there's no mandate from the government right now that everyone has to have a vaccine. But employers can, it's industry specific, and employers can create policies whereby, again, this is different for every context, and you have to explore everything in like the context and make sure that everyone's human rights are protected. But let's say if the industry is one which is heavily geared towards the service of individual clients who are at severe risk of like they are at severe risk of if in the event there's any sort of transmission, and there is this set policy that requires employees to take certain measures to minimize that, and you have one employee that blatantly disregards all of that, that gives rise to a termination, and you can certainly terminate for those reasons. But again, it's very fact specific. Every case is very different, and you have to take into account all the circumstances of health and safety and human rights.
Thank you, Jim.
Sorry, Paul, I was just going to add just to what Jim said. Obviously, we haven't seen any, as I said, any cases relating to terminations due to, refusal to vaccinate or anything like that. So I do expect that a lot of what we're saying will evolve, and we will start to see these issues in the tribunals and in the courts, and get some more guidance as to what employers can and can't do.
Thanks, Jessica. Thank you. And I'll kind of, in the spirit of weaving questions together, I'll do that for another couple. The following up really from what we're talking about here is, and one of them is we're talking about the human rights and the privacy, etc., for the person who doesn't want to get vaccinated. But what about the employer trying to look after the interests of everybody else who has been and has expressed concerns about working with somebody who's refusing to?
Yeah, I mean, I'll take that first, and Jim, you can add on. I had that exact situation actually come up in advising an employer recently, where an employee had traveled down to the border repeatedly, and the rumor was had contracted COVID and was still showing up in the workplace. That employee, when confronted about it, said, no, I'm fine. I've been tested. I'm negative. So there were these sort of two competing situations going on. And the employer came to me and said, what do we do, right? We've got a group of employees unsafe, and another employee saying, what are you doing demanding to know what I was doing on my weekend? That's my business, and that kind of a thing. So it's a tough situation. And we talked a lot about, as Jim said, documenting things, reminding, in that situation, the employer reminded that employee about the rules, about their COVID policy, asked them to sign an acknowledgement confirming an understanding about it, and then went back to the other employees and assured them that it had taken the proper steps to keep the workplace safe. So, these are difficult situations. And employers in those situations, if there's enough employees with concern over another one, they could ask that employee to work at home for some set period of time. Could be a reasonable way to look into it, or to appease the rest of the staff. So sometimes an employer has to take those steps, but my advice is always, if the employer is communicating with all the employees about what it's doing to try to keep everyone safe, that's the way it can most protect itself from liability. Jim, I don't know if you have anything to add.
I think that was a very good summary of what I would have said. But the only thing I probably would add is it's a constant exercise of weighing the pros and cons and weighing what your risks are compared to, and just selecting the option that's the least risky out of all of those. And it's just like Jessica said, this is not it's not an easy exercise. It's a very complicated, and one which I think getting some advice will certainly assist in that process.
Thanks. And so vaccinations are obviously one part of the process of keeping everybody safe. But as we've said before, the mandating of having the vaccine is not there. It's not mandatory to have them. But obviously it's mandatory to do other things such as the mask wearing and other practices within a business. So what are your rights as an employer if an employee refuses to follow some of those protocols that you have around mask wearing or whatever in terms of office safety? And I guess there are some people who may have an exemption again from wearing a mask. And where do you stand as an employer in those areas?
So it's, I mean, it's that same analysis that we talked about where, you know, if an employee has an actual disability or a religious observance, something in a protected category under the human rights, and that's why they're refusing to wear a mask, or that's why they're refusing to come to work or follow the other protocols, then you have a duty to accommodate. Beyond that, if an employee continues to refuse to follow the safety protocols, like for example, every employer has to have the safety check. I know I have to fill it out if I go into the office, as does Jim. If an employee simply doesn't want to be bothered in filling those out, then that's a basis for discipline, right? It's the same as following any other policies or protocols in the workplace. The COVID health and safety requirements are just as important as the bullying and harassment rules, as the no alcohol and smoking in the workplace, or any other rule that an employer may have, unless and if there is an actual reason that an employer needs to accommodate them. So, you know, I advise employers to take steps and discipline them the same they would in any other circumstance. Do it clearly, do it in writing, remind them of the rules. And if they continue to refuse to follow them, then they need to take steps which can include terminating them, possibly for cause, if they're doing it willfully or, you know, knowingly. And those are the situations where I always say, give your lawyer a call before you pull the trigger and terminate for cause. Make sure you're fully protected, but certainly you're within your rights to take those steps.
Thanks, Jessica. Thanks for the answer. An interesting question just posted, and it's around an employee who has to come to work on transit. They don't drive. It's how they get to work, and they just don't feel safe. They're concerned about transmission through transit, and they don't want to return to work because of that.
So I can probably comment on that. Again, it goes back to what Jessica said earlier about accommodation to the point of undue hardship. And it's also about just conducting a holistic review of the whole situation as well. Now, I suspect that the issue here is that you have an employee whose only means is to explore transit. Well, discuss other options with the employer. With the employee, does she have someone that she can perhaps carpool? Is there maybe other, like, could she maybe adjust her hours to come in at a time where there's not that many people on the transit? Explore ways which she can work at home, work remotely. Those are all options available that the employer must also exercise before proceeding to actually terminate the employee. It's very tempting at times to rush to judgments and rush to conclusions, but the employer does have the obligation, just because of what I talked about earlier, about one's job does matter a lot to an employee, and the courts do recognize that, and they impose a number of obligations on the employer. And one of those is basically the duty to find out what it is that's preventing this employee from being able to allaying that employee's concerns and basically taking reasonable measures to try to have that employee work.
And I would just add to that, you know, until the province says that transit is unsafe, which they haven't, then I think you as an employer can point to that. You know, we're taking our guidance from the provincial health. We're not the doctors, we're not the health professionals, we're not the ones determining what's safe and what's not safe. So I think we all have to work within the constraints of the information we're provided, and you as an employer should share that with your employees. And again, it goes back to what I said at the beginning. The more you can talk about these things, give them information, and show them there's no restrictions on transit other than wearing a mask, or whatever the concerns are, then you've satisfied your obligation as an employer, once you've looked into the other options that Jim suggested as well. But, I think employees need to be reminded that we're all working in the same constraints and that the province has not banned buses right now. So at the point where they are still available and considered safe in the same way schools are still open, we're expected to continue to carry on within those boundaries. And so for an employee to say, but I don't feel safe, but I have no other special reasons for it, may be unreasonable.
The one last thing I will add is the Employment Standards Act only defines work as basically when the employee is conducting work. So if the employee is not coming to work, then the employer is under no obligation to pay that employee. The employer always has the option to give the employee, all right, well, you've stated your concerns. Would you like to take an unpaid leave of absence? And during that period, unpaid means unpaid. And at a certain point, the employee will need to assess their situation, which is, are my concerns worth me not making a living for myself?
Yeah. Thank you, Jim. But we're getting near the end of time here, everybody. If there are any people who asked a question who would like either further explanation or clarification on the question they've already asked, please post that in the next minute or two. Or if you had a question that you wanted to share with us, please do that right now. But I guess what I'm getting from what both of you are saying in large part is make sure that there's transparency from the employer's point of view in terms of what their work safe protocols are and policies are and what they are doing to ensure the health and safety of their workforce, and keep that open dialogue going on about the importance of everybody playing their part in creating and maintaining that safe workplace. Is that a reasonable summary, and is there anything you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, I think that's exactly it, Paul. The only thing I would add, and it sounds like you're already doing that on behalf of these organizations, is to stay abreast of the changes as they're coming, right? Because I think, it's been a bit of a crazy time for us employment lawyers. Every week, at the beginning with all the leaves and the different, the alphabet letters of different, monetary assistance being provided, it's a constantly changing landscape. So I think as hard as that must be for employers, we are going to have to remain open to flexibility, to revising the policies, to switching our requirements, and just to be adaptable. And I'm sure that's really, really difficult for a lot of businesses who are trying to stay afloat. But I encourage you to keep up to date with whatever the news and the requirements are, and to do your best to just stay adaptable and tell your employees that you're doing the best you can, and these are really, really difficult situations.
Thanks, Jessica. And I think picking up on a point you just made, and thanks for making that point, is that a key part of the work that we've been doing as an organization over this last year and a bit has been there to reflect the views of the business community as government starts to formulate and form its policies, to make sure that we're providing feedback to the business community on what impacts those policies may have, and then providing that back to government. So it's been that constant two-way street. So I think most of the people on the call here are members of ours. I think we might have some that are not part of the group, but I'd encourage everybody to keep connected with us, to keep connected with the information that we're sharing with you, and share that information back to us. As I mentioned earlier, I sit on a few different task forces with government, and really important that they hear from us as a business community as well. So thanks very much to both Jim and Jessica. That was excellent. It's a really important subject right now, and I'm sure I speak on behalf of everybody in attendance today in saying that it was great information, very clearly shared with us. And I think one thing that we've found as well over this year is it's really important to make sure that the information that we're sharing is clear and understandable and is practical, that we can all use. And thanks for doing that today. That was very
pleasure.
Important. So be sure, everybody, to check out the upcoming events on our website. Later on this week, tomorrow, we have a Sustainability 101 session at 10 o'clock in the morning, which is transforming business and community and a sustainable supply chain. Should be an excellent presentation there. On next Tuesday, we have a really interesting session with the President and CEO of Fraser Health, Dr. Victoria Lee, and Fraser Health's Chief Medical Officer, Dr. Elizabeth Brodkin. So anything you want to know about what's going on in the Fraser Health area, which obviously we're a part of here in Burnaby, that's a great session to be a part of. And then we've been talking a lot about government supports. And on the 27th of this month, the Launch Online Grant program will be explained in great detail, and is where businesses can get up to $7,500 to pay the costs of building an e-commerce store or an online booking system. So keep an eye out for those, and again, keep the feedback coming to us. We're here to help you, and we love getting your feedback on what we need to do. Thanks again to Jim and Jessica. We really appreciate you doing this for us today, and have a great rest of the week, everybody, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.